Okay, I got enmeshed in yet another argument with somebody who's a fellow believer. And he really took aback my going into such scholarly niceties that have no bearing upon the Christian life. Actually, they do. So I decided, well, let's stop James chapter 1 for a couple of YouTube publications so that we can address this problem, because it's not a nicety. Everybody I talk to, most of them, come up with the idea that the Bible has been changed so many times. Who knows what it really says? And most of the time it's the Old Testament. But we take one thing at a time. The Old Testament is, people think it's been around for many years in its original form. Well, the original form is long gone. The form of Hebrew is a different form using ancient Hebrew characters. But it has been fixed and revised for centuries about the most accurate system the Jewish scholars could possibly provide, and it's the most reliable book we ever have on the planet. So I just took this one article. It's on my website, BibleStudyManuals.net. Hebrew text, .htm, number 13. If you copy this down, you can look at it and read it for yourself. I'm going to skip over a lot of things. This is, if you need to provide information, because the atheists come along and say, well, we're ridiculous, the Bible, we don't even have what it was written, and the people manufacture it, and there's so many contradictions and errors, it's ridiculous. Well, study a little bit of history on this, and you'll change your mind. It's written by and edited by Samuel Macaulay Jackson, the New Schaff Herzog Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge, 1908. It's just a few years ago. It was published nearly a century ago and does not reflect the general confirmation given to the traditional Masoretic text by the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in 1947. But we have the pre-Masoretic period. The extant Hebrew text of the Old Testament is commonly called the Masoretic to distinguish it from the text of the ancient versions that come before that, as well as from the Hebrew text of former ages. This Masoretic text does not present the original form, but a text which, within a certain period, was fixed by Jewish scholars as the correct and only authoritative one. And I believe that because of the extent to which they came, the comparison they had with all the documents around, and the translations in the world's languages. When and how this official Masoretic text was fixed was formerly a matter of controversy, especially during the 17th century. One party, headed by the Buxtorfs, father and son, and the interest of the view of inspiration then prevalent, held to the absolute completeness and infallibility, and hence the exclusive value of the Masoretic text. They attributed this to Ezra and the men of the great synagogue who, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, were supposed to have purified the text from all accumulated error over the ages. They added vowel points, the accents, and other punctuation marks, thus settling the reading and the pronunciation. They fixed the canon, made the right division into verses, paragraphs, and books, and finally, by the providence of God and the care of the Jews, the text thus was believed to have been kept from all error and to present the veritable Word of God. It's the best effort that has ever been made to preserve the context of any written document. The Greek classics and everything have pale in comparison to what this effort of these people and ones before and after have done. So we have a trustworthy Old Testament. This view of the text prevailed especially when the Protestant scholasticism was at its height and may be designated as the Orthodox Protestant position. So we can go on here. Let's see what they actually did. Concerning the oldest history of the text of the Old Testament writings, there exists almost no positive information. The manuscripts were so old they deteriorated and were discarded but copied into newer versions, and a lot of errors were skipped in because of lack of discipline. The books were written probably upon skins, perhaps also on linen, as paper was used only from very early times in Egypt. It was possible that it was employed. Parchment appears to have been used later, and the roll seems to have been the usual form. The pen was a pointed reed, and the character was the Old Hebrew, which was almost identical with the Phoenician and Moabitic Moabite stone. Specimens of this writing are also preserved in the Salome inscription on gems, 18th and 17th century, on coins of the Hasmoneans and those belonging to the time of the Jewish-Roman War, and in somewhat different form in Samaritan writings. But like the Phoenicians and Moabites, the Hebrews separated the words by a point or a stroke, but these signs do not seem to have been used regularly, since the Septuagint often makes word divisions different from those of the Masoretic text. Septuagint is a Greek translation about 200 to 300 years BC, and it was actually used in the first century by Jesus and the prophets and the disciples, because that was the language that was they were familiar with at the time. Jewish tradition mentions several passages in which the separation of words was regarded as doubtful. So the difference between ancient and modern texts consisted in this, that the former were written without vowels and accents. The Hebrew writing, like Semitic writing in general, was essentially consonantal, with the consonants, no vowels. Vowels were not written. And while the language lived, this occasioned no difficulty to the speakers or readers. But centuries later, this does have some problems in interpretation. So all these wonderful Jewish scholars over the centuries have continued to fix the errors and keep the text as pure as they can. No details are at hand concerning the way in which the text was multiplied and preserved, and inasmuch as the writings did not then have a popular estimation the character they came later to possess, it is likely that they were less carefully handled, and that the same amount of pains were not taken in copying them. But it was fixed. This statement rests upon the fact that those parts of the Old Testament which we possess in double forms vary in ways that indicate a corruption of the text reaching back to pre-canonical times when copies were neither made nor corrected so laboriously. We have a change in style of writing. A new epoch commenced after the exile, Babylonian exile, when the holy writings were raised to canonical dignity, and his holy writings were venerated and handled with ever-increasing care and conscientiousness. This veneration was not accorded to all biblical writing at once, but only to that part of the canon called the Law. The epoch begins with Ezra and extends to the close of the Talmud in about 500 A.D. During this period, not only were the form of writing and the text fixed, but also the pronunciation and division. In short, the major part of the present Masorah was collected in verbal form. A change of an external kind was the development of a sacred writing under the influence of the Aramaic character. This was because it was a so-called square or Assyrian type character. Jewish tradition ascribes the introduction of the square character to Ezra and calls it expressly an Aramaic writing that the Jews adopted in place of their Hebrew, which they left to the Samaritans. A study of the Assyrian, Persian, and Cilician seals and coins of the Aramaic monuments from the 3rd to the 1st century BC and of the Palmyrene inscriptions from the 1st to the 3rd century AD has permitted the tracing of the development of the present Hebrew character through 1,000 years back to the 8th century. Ezra, therefore, may be have influenced the use of the Aramaic alphabet, but the square character was not developed in his day, but not for centuries afterward, nor was the Aramaic alphabet then used outside of the narrow circle of the scribes. Not only did the Samaritans retain the ancient script for their Pentateuch, but among the Jews also it must have been used for a long time, since it was found on coins down to the time of Bar Kokhba. Matthew verse 18 provides that the Aramaic writing had become popular by the time that gospel was written, since in the ancient Hebrew the letter Yod was by no means the smallest. Taking all in all, it may be assumed with certainty that the use of the new alphabet in Bible manuscripts of the last pre-Christian centuries was general, a result which is also confirmed by a careful examination of the Septuagint with reference to the manuscripts used by the translators. Especially must have been the case with the Tetragrammaton retained in many copies of the Greek translation, which was no doubt written in the Aramaic script, since it was read erroneously by the Christians. Concerning this development, it may have been assumed that the latest Old Testament writings were written not in the ancient Hebrew, but in Aramaic, but the authors themselves After the Aramaic writing was once in use among the Jews, it soon took the form in which we now have it. It's easier to maintain accuracy that way, especially with the vowel markings. The descriptions which Jerome and the Talmud give of the different letters fully harmonize with the form which is still found in manuscripts. The minute rules laid down by the Talmud as to calligraphy and orthography made further development of the square writing impossible, and therefore the writing of the manuscripts varies scarcely at all through the centuries, excepting perhaps that the German and Polish Jews have the so-called Tam script, which is somewhat angular, whereas the Spanish Jews and the Welsh are more rounded. Well, attempts to fix the text. The veneration shown for the canonical writings during this period naturally led to a greater care and treatment of them, and above all to perception of the necessity of critically fixing the text. As soon as the ancient writings obtained canonical authority, they were used in divine service and became the standard of doctrine and life. The necessity of having one standard text naturally asserted itself. For the sake of accuracy, the preparation of such a text began with the law. The other two divisions, the prophets and the hagiographa, became authoritative only in the course of centuries, and naturally their text did not receive attention in the early period. However, criticism during that period was of little value. There is no doubt that faithful and correct copies existed, especially of such books as were publicly read, but this could not prevent errors and mistakes from creeping in the copies, which were generally circulated. So when Josephus and Philo speak of the great care bestowed by the Jews upon their sacred writings, this cannot be referred to earlier centuries and concerns more the content than the linguistic minutiae of the text. In the oldest critical documents, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, there is evidence about 500 to 100 BC to show that the manuscripts most approved and most widely diffused contain many verbal differences, and these variations are not to be charged, as was formerly done, to carelessness or willfulness on the part of the Hellenistic Jews and Samaritans, but they are explained by the lesser importance attached to exact uniformity of text and to the existence of mistakes in the current copies. And when the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch agree in good readings, and still oftener in bad ones, against the Masoretic text, it may be concluded that these readings were spread by many copies current among the Palestinian Jews, and are therefore not to be regarded as offensive. But after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., when Judaism was subject to the authority of the rabbis, it became possible to prepare a uniform standard text, although this idea was not realized until many generations had worked upon it. The Greek versions of the 2nd century had already fewer variations from the Masoretic text. Still nearer the latter text is the Hebrew text of Origen and Jerome. The Talmud itself bears witness, by the agreement of its biblical quotations with the Masoretic text, that the consonantal text was practically finished before the Talmudic era closed. It is not possible to say upon what principles the text was treated, but the way in which the custodians presented the individuality of the several authors, books, and periods is remarkable, and proves that intentional and arbitrary changes of the text were not made by these critics. That they changed passages for dramatic, especially for anti-Christian reasons, has sometimes been asserted, and has long ago been acknowledged to be a baseless accusation. We have so many manuscripts available, 8 to 10,000, and it by far exceeds the Greek classics or other ancient documents previous to that. That it's the highly attested book of the world. Where they mention changes, they make clear that then they followed the testimony of manuscripts, the number of which was probably not very great. The fact that in the first centuries after Christ the text approximates our present Masoretic reading shows that a certain recension became authoritative, which was possible only after a certain manuscript had been taken as the norm. Of such a standard codex, copies could easily be made, or one could correct his own copies in accordance with it. There's a number of scholars, like Oles, Ozen, and Lagarde, speak, therefore, of some such archetype which was slavishly followed in every respect. The critical apparatus of the time is concealed in dissociated fragments in the later Masorah, but cannot be separated from the other matter. The Talmud and the other older midrashim